are very happy to be here with you today for the official launch of our biodiversity database, Biodiversity Impact Analytics, powered by the GBS, the Global Biodiversity Score, co-developed by Carbon for Finance and CDC Biodiversité. As you can see, so we'll have a few words of opening with Marc Abadie, and then we will spend some time to describe the methodology. So what's the Global Biodiversity Score, the metrics, how we computed the data, aggregated the data at Carbon for Finance to be able to develop this database. And it will be interesting to see what's the impact on an index, the Stock 600, because the aim of this methodology and database is to be able to measure the biodiversity footprint of portfolios. It was a choice for Carbon for Finance to cover all sectors and a global coverage from the beginning. And then there will be a demonstration of our BIA-GBS platform to visualize the results. What's interesting to see is the first testimonies of our clients. How can the data be used with different actors, fintech, with Rift, with an asset manager, La Financière de l'Échiquier, and an asset owner, the CDC Asset Management Division. So I will leave the floor to Marc Abadie, who will say a few words. Thanks.
Thank you, Marianne. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to find you all, partly in this place at the headquarters of Caisse des Dépôts in Paris, partly via Zoom. I hope we will not have any technical problem. We are more than 500 gathered for this new stage for our work on the measurement of biodiversity footprint. We are just 2 months before the World Conservation Congress in Marseille, so I think it is a good time to speak about biodiversity with this approach. For many years, as a major financial institution, the Caisse des Dépôts wishes to understand the links between economy and biodiversity. And to this end, CDC Biodiversité, its subsidiary, was asked to develop tools to better understand the impacts and dependencies on biodiversity of all economic activities. For 5 years now, Caisse des Dépôts has supported the Global Biodiversity Score project. Thank you to all the people in this room from CDC Biodiversité who work for that. And last year in May, we launched the GBS for corporate, and since then, more than 20 societies, 20 companies have chosen to act for biodiversity by using the GBS. Nowadays, we think with our partner, where is she? She's there, Carbon 4, that it is time now to deploy a solution for investors, to engage a constructive dialogue between these two kinds of actors and to build a common language. On the corporate side, the ecosystem is growing rapidly with more and more assessments and trained consultants. And on the investor side, the solutions take a little longer to be developed, but many are asking for. So we decided to build a real partnership with Carbon for Finance and CDC Biodiversité. The DNA of Carbon for Finance and globally Carbon for Consulting, we think are very close to CDC Biodiversité. We share the value of transparency, reliability, and we think we have the same, in a nutshell, we have the same vision to overcome the environmental crisis. Today, the first and very important step we were taking with the launch of the BIA-GBS database, which provide access to operational data on biodiversity for a large portion of listed assets. It is a first step, and this first step will improve. And this first step, of course, is in line with the latest regulatory development in France, and we hope in Europe now. And our methods is also in line with the European taxonomy, which is in progress. So I wish good success for this meeting. And now I leave the floor by video to Jean-Marc Jancovici for Carbon 4. Thank you.
After climate change, biodiversity, or the decrease of biodiversity rather, is the second major increase which is common to all human activities. The financial world has begun to address the problem of climate change, let's say 10 years ago now, with various initiatives and various metrics to which Carbon for Finance is proud to have contributed and is now trying to do its best to help financial actors to understand what is beyond their investment and how much they are at risk regarding what they have done and where they are invested. We have decided, along with CDC Biodiversité, to explore now the new field of assessing the impact on biodiversity of the underlying activities in which financial actors are invested. In practical terms, it means that we have to design, or rather we have to use a metric which is transversal and that can be applied to any kind of investment. And we have to use a metrics or a unit which is also common to all impacts on biodiversity. These two steps we have gone through these two steps recently. CDC Biodiversité has designed the method, and Carbon for Finance has, on the basis of that method, developed a matrix called Biodiversity Impact Analytics, which allows to assess any kind of investment and rate it regarding the overall impact it has, or the overall impact the underlying activity has on biodiversity, or rather the decrease of biodiversity. We really hope that this improvement, or that this new step, is going to help the financial actors, again, to understand what they do, knowing that understanding what one does is not necessarily finding an easy way out. And actually, both for climate change and for biodiversity, there are no easy ways out, because it applies to any activity we have. But definitely, as long as we do not measure, it is impossible to know where to act in a relevant way. So again, we are very happy to present this improvement and this new method called Biodiversity Impact Analytics, which has been designed on the basis of the Global Biodiversity Score of CDC Biodiversité, and I hope that you will enjoy this presentation.
We're very proud at Carbon for Finance to have developed this biodiversity database. We strongly believe there's a link between the two communities, the climate and biodiversity, and we need to work together in the same direction to solve the issue and the problems and find some solutions. So it was natural for us to develop this new database, and Jean-Marc will say with his words when it's available. But basically, since last year in 2020, we have decided to enter into this strategic partnership with CDC Biodiversité. So we had at Carbon for Finance a successful experience to convert the Carbon 4 consulting methodology into a database, and that's what we're going to do with CDC Biodiversity. We experience on the climate side that sometimes it's difficult, it's a challenge to move from a very scientific and robust methodology and to move that into data for investors to be ready to use and scalable. So that's why that's what we're going to do with Biodiversity Impact Analytics database. We want to develop a database to help measure the risk of ecological transition, to communicate impact on biodiversity, and to facilitate engagement. Try to tell a story with the companies you finance. Try to tell a story with your final investors. So we found out that the analysis conducted on climate has a lot of synergy with biodiversity. We collect a lot of information, a lot of raw data for climate with our bottom-up approach and our existing databases. So we'll capitalize on this to build this new technology. And the objective of that is to provide a robust, scientific, and scalable database to our clients and investors. I think now it will be interesting is to have more insights of methodology itself and case studies to have practical examples of what we're trying to do.
Hello everyone, so Antoine Vallier, I'm a biodiversity footprint expert at CDC Biodiversité. I will present you here quickly a few core concepts of the underlying methodology for biodiversity footprinting that we're using here for BIA-GBS, so that you have those concepts in mind when we'll get more into the details of a case study on the stock 600. So what is the GBS? So first of all, maybe a few words on the CDC Biodiversité ecosystem that we've been building for the past 6 years, and what are the strengths we have today. We have 6 years experience on the field of biodiversity footprinting, which in that field is already quite a lot. We do have a strong link with corporate. I will come back to that. We are really building a full ecosystem between corporate and investors, as we think that it's very important to build this common language. We found the Club B4B+ with around 40 corporate companies at the moment in 2016 along the development of the GBS. We have a long-term support of Caisse des Dépôts, and our values are really, as Marianne and Marc were mentioning, the technical robustness and the transparency. We did conduct a review committee in 2019, and that's something that we will keep on doing, because we do believe that in that field of biodiversity, as it is complex and innovative, it's very important to have something very transparent, so it is easier to build the consensus. Talking about consensus, we want to highlight the fact that we are not building this methodology on our own. We are very connected with all the national and international frameworks regarding biodiversity and business, regarding reporting, regarding international trajectories, international goals. I will mention that we are part of the technical expert group of the TNFD, of the SBTN. We're also part of the Alliant project, which gather all the developers on the biodiversity footprint methodologies, so that we really participate to build this consensus. And the GBS and BIA-GBS is fed and will be fed by all those updates and in terms of technical and regulatory matters. So maybe now a bit more about the methodology itself. I will highlight a few key concepts here. So we are focusing on the ecosystem integrity. So it's one of the 3 dimensions that are already identified by the IPBS today on biodiversity. We rely on the Global model pressure impact relationships, which has several consequences in terms of coverage. Realm coverage, we are covering terrestrial and aquatic freshwater biodiversity with respectively 5 pressures for terrestrial and 6 pressures for aquatic. We do not cover marine biodiversity at the moment. In terms of IPBS pressures, we have a very good coverage, except for invasive species, where as for marine biodiversity, we at the moment lack scientific data to plug it into a model such as the GBS. The fact that we're using Globio also implies that we're using the Msa metric. I will come back to that later. Another very important feature is that we focus on the full value chain, more specifically on scope 1, 2, 3 upstream. We do consider downstream on a case-by-case for material sectors, and that's a future development for BIA-GBS. In terms of time accounting, I won't get too technical here, but it's a notion that is important to get in mind for biodiversity, as it is different than for climate. We do focus on both the stock and the flow of impacts. The main reason is that contrary to climate, we don't have a budget for new impacts. We consider that we already overshoot the budget for biodiversity. So which means that we need to first stop the biodiversity erosion, but also get some gains in the future. And in order to capture where those gains can be performed, we also need to focus on the stock of impact. So that's something which is different from the climate. Another feature, and that's something we are currently developing to have something a bit more handy, we do also have a vision on the dependency, not only on the impact, and I will briefly show you how it's done later on. So what is the MSA? So here I will show you the metrics. MSA is a ratio originally. So 100% is a pristine environment, and the more you apply pressure, the lower the ratio goes, and it can go to 0% when you reach absolutely no life, equivalent to a parking lot. We do not use the percentage, we use the surfacic version of the MSA. So by simply multiplying this ratio by the surface on which we are accounting the biodiversity. So we have, in this MSA square meter, we have both the information of the quality of biodiversity and the quantity in terms of surface to which it applies. Here, I would like to highlight the fact that as I was mentioning, we are covering two realms. We have two time dimensions. So in terms of properly reporting biodiversity, you actually have 4 compartments, which are given by those 2 dimensions with 2 items each. And that's the framework for reporting. And I will show you later, in the next slides, how we would like, we suggest to normalize those 4 compartments in order to, at the end, have only one figure, because we understand that in some cases, especially for investors, it's important to be able to manipulate only one figure, even though we do not suggest to only focus on one of those compartments, because they are all equally important, but you cannot simply hide them, as they have magnitudes, and they are different in terms of nature and magnitudes as well. So in terms of normalization, you have 2 normalization. I will quickly go on that. So just you have an idea of the figures you will look at later on. The MSA PPB is a normalization in order to add biodiversity, terrestrial biodiversity and aquatic biodiversity. The idea is that the quantity, the absolute quantity available is much larger on the terrestrial side, because terrestrial ecosystems are larger than freshwater ones. So structurally, the impacts on terrestrial are more important. So you don't want to send them one for one, otherwise you will underestimate the importance of aquatic ones. So the PPB is parts per billion. We simply translate them in terms of a fraction of the total quantity. We chose billion because otherwise the figures would be too small. The second level of normalization is MSA PPB star. This one is to mix, to aggregate the static and the dynamic. Here we actually see the static impact. So static impact is the stock of impacts which applies in the which occurred in the past. So if you have a wheat field, for example, it's the static impact is the difference between the biodiversity you observe on your wheat field and the reference biodiversity. Then the dynamic impact would be if the field expand during the assessment period, and that would lead to a conversion that would lead to a new impact, so a flow of impact, a dynamic impact. So this occupation of biodiversity, this static impact, can be seen as a cost of opportunity. We consider very roughly that an ecosystem would recover within 50 years. So if you occupy this space during 1 year, you have a missed opportunity of biodiversity recovery of 1/50th of the difference. So simply we divide the static impact by 50 to compare them to the dynamic impact, and that's how we reach the MSA PPB star that you will see later on in the slides. Lastly, I just wanted to give you also an idea about the data that we're using in the GBS. It's obviously very important here when we're building databases such as BIA-GBS. It's actually the core of the problem is accessing good quality data to input into the model. GBS is very versatile in terms of data that we can use. Here you have a global layout that highlights the different pieces of the puzzle that compose the GBS and the associated data that are linked to each of these pieces. So you see that we have 4 main categories of data that we could use: financial, physical flow, pressure, data on pressure directly, and ecological surveys. And they are of different quality and different availability. And once again, the GBS is built to be able to use the best available data depending on the context. So that's it for me for the methodological side. Sorry, it went very quickly. Just get those concepts in mind. Obviously, you will have the opportunity to get the slides and get further on this. And now I will leave the floor to Jules, who will present you how, given that methodology, the BIA-GBS database is built.
So thank you, Antoine, and hello everyone. So I'm Jules Massin, carbon data analyst at Carbon for Finance, and I work on the construction of the BIA-GBS model. So now that we introduced to you the principle of the Global Biodiversity Score and the key metrics we use to measure company biodiversity impact, maybe we can focus on the Biodiversity Impact Analytics model. So how is this portfolio focus tool built? How does it incorporate the GBS? And most importantly, how it can be used by investors to really deeply understand and report on the biodiversity impact of their portfolio. So firstly, let's take a closer look at the different pillars on which the BIA-GBS model is built. So the first pillar is, as Antoine introduced, the Global Biodiversity Score, which is the core methodology. It provides us with the specific indicators like the MSA square meters and the MSA PPB star at companies level. So the next question to build a portfolio focus tool is how can you aggregate this data, this company level data, in order to scale up and meet the needs of investors on a large perimeter. So here we use the issuer and instrument database, that is the Carbon Finance database. And we were able to build a large entity database that cover all sectors and major market indexes constituents using the GBS. We are also able to incorporate the biodiversity methodology in our portfolio analytics processing. And so that's how we are able to process a portfolio, to link securities to their issuer. And this way we are now able to provide both aggregated results at portfolio level. It means like, for instance, you have a portfolio biodiversity footprint in intensity and absolute in MSA PPB star. That's the main indicator you can use. But at the same time, you have detailed results at the credit risk or issuer level that you can explore. And this way we can offer a global coverage of main equity and fixed income market indexes. The last pillars of the BIA-GBS are Carbon for Finance proprietary databases, CRIS, Climate Risk Impact Screening, and CIA, Carbon Impact Analytics. So these two databases were integrated with the GBS and combined in order to refine the biodiversity impact analysis and to build this unique portfolio-focused tool. So in the next slide, we'll see how these two databases are used in the BIA-GBS. So firstly, the Climate Risk Impact Screening database. So that's a database that aims at measuring companies' exposure to climate risk. It uses a database gathering companies' activities breakdown by geography and sector. That's a database that is really important in order to understand the company's business. And that's the same input we'll use in BIA-GBS. On the other side, we have the CIA, Carbon Impact Analytics database. So that's C4F's historical methodology on transition risk. This is a bottom-up methodology based on operational data that enables us to recalculate a company's emission and take into account GHG emissions that are related to a company's direct operation, but also all the emission that occurs along the value chain. This is a concept that is really important because as for the risk of transition, and as Antoine said, as we'll see later in the presentation of the results, the scope 3 is a really essential concept for climate change, but also for biodiversity. And that's why C4F's GHG data was really an added value for the BIA-GBS. So now let's see how this data is incorporated in the model. So here we can see the model that Antoine introduced. So firstly, the CRIS database input is used at the very beginning of the process. That's the step where we want to really go deep into understanding the company's business based on its revenue breakdown and geographic area breakdown. So at the moment, we use a sector country level revenue breakdown, and we are working on an asset level database for specific sectors that are CapEx intensive. But this database is used to, this database that is based on revenue enables us to have global coverage on all sectors. So we thought, as Marianne said, that it's a very important step. Further in the model, the CIA GHG induced emissions are directly translated into pressures, so the climate change pressures. It's really important at this step because it enables us to, as we said, and as Antoine said, to have this value chain evaluation. And so this pressure is connected then to impact on biodiversity. So that's the overview of the BIA-GBS model. Now, if we quickly look at the roadmap and future developments, during July, so the first iteration of our platform will be available to our clients. So it will we'll be able to display companies' results and portfolio BIA analysis with a global coverage. The next big step then will be to improve the model with refined data inputs. Also, we'll work on developing a bottom-up approach, and we'll work on building a framework to measure alignment with international targets. And the last step, which is a big step for carbon finance, will be to merge the three methodologies in the same platform in order to give a full vision, to offer investors a full vision on climate change and biodiversity risks exposure. So before we move on to an example of the results, maybe we can just show the key messages of the BIA-GBS. So maybe just the key messages to remember. So it relies on two recognized models, the XGBoost model and the Global Bio. Based on this model and CDCB expertise and tools that provide a set of really detailed indicators at companies level, we were able to combine that with C4F's database and C4F's portfolio analytics process to build a large database that can provide investors both results at portfolio level on a global coverage, and it also offers the opportunity to explore data along multiple dimensions, such as the 11 pressures that Antoine talked about, or the 4 compartments. And the most important is that at this point we can cover all sectors and have a global coverage on main equity and listed index. So maybe now my colleagues Lou Velgreen and Théophile Anquetin will present a practical case in order to explore the main results of portfolio analysis and the insights that can be derived from BIA-GBS results. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Théophile Anquetin. I worked with Jules, Lou, and Charles and Antoine on the development of the tool, and I will now present you a case study
on what the results look like when we apply this methodology to an index. So for this case study, we took the stock 600 index, which is composed of the 600 biggest market capitalization in Europe, as you may or may not know. So if we look at the results, we can see on the top right of the screen that the absolute impact of the portfolio expressed in MSA PPB star, so that's the normalized version of the MSA, encompassing all static, dynamic, aquatic, and terrestrial impacts, is 84 MSA PPB star. So this number alone is not going to give you much information. What's interesting to remember is that it depends on the footprint of each constituent of the index and the size of the investment put in this index. So for this case study, we ventilated €1 billion among all constituents of the stock 600. And what you can see at the center of the screen is the amount covered by the methodology of these €1 billion. So this implies a 99% coverage rate on the stocks 600 index. So if you want to compare your portfolio to a benchmark or to another portfolio, having an absolute metric is not going to be much helpful. So what you can rely on is intensity metric, and that's what we provide at the top left of the screen. Here you can see that for each €1 billion invested in the stocks 600, it generates an impact of 85 MSA PPB star. So aggregated metrics like the MSA PPB star are really important to build KPIs and communicate results, even for comparison purposes. But where it's really interesting is to dig a little bit deeper into what composes this aggregated impact. And that's what we're doing at the middle of the screen. Here you have a repartition of the impact of the index by compartments. So as Antoine explained, it's a combination of aquatic, terrestrial, dynamic, and static compartments. So what you can see in the table is that the terrestrial impacts are much, much bigger when expressed in MSA kilometer squared, because there's no normalization at all. So obviously the terrestrial is going to be much higher than the aquatic impact. And the same goes for the static versus dynamic impact, because it's the stock of all of the impacts versus the flow of all of the impacts. And remember, there's no normalization. So to better understand and interpret these results, we provide real-life equivalent so that you can communicate on these. So here, for example, the static terrestrial impact is a degraded surface, roughly equivalent to the size of the city of Paris. Okay, and the flow of the impacts, so all of the impacts generated during the period, that's an annual biodiversity loss, roughly equal to the degradation of 917 soccer fields. Okay, so if we shift to the normalized version of the MSA PPB of the MSA, you can see that the image is much more balanced. So you don't have such a big difference between dynamic and static. Obviously, terrestrial is still going to be bigger, but you actually see that the dynamic terrestrial is higher than the static terrestrial. So that it means that the rate at which activities of the constituents impact biodiversity is higher than the static impacts when you normalize everything. And to finish, we also provide investment intensity, and that allows you to tell another story, right? So for each €1,000 invested in the stock 600, you generate, it corresponds to a degraded surface of 131 meters squared, and that's roughly the size of a Danish house, just to give you an idea. And now.
Okay, so now that we've seen the global impact of the portfolio, we can deep dive into more precise results. And for instance, the first segmentation that's really interesting to look at is the pressure segmentation. So you can find the 11 pressure we've talked about earlier. The terrestrial are in orange and the aquatic are in blue. So what's really interesting to see on the top of the page is the 4 main pressures. Here we can see climate change is predominant, and that's important to notice because it really shows the interconnection between climate change and biodiversity impacts. The second most important pressure here is land use on this portfolio. The second interesting segmentation we can look at is the scope segmentation. And here we see that scope 3 is clearly predominant compared to scope 1 and scope 2. This really underlines the importance to take into account scope 3 emissions in order to have an accurate look at the portfolio and to understand the real impact of companies. And if you're really, if you still have a doubt about this, we've just written an article about the importance of scope 3 emissions, and you can find it on our website.
Thank you. So in addition to repartition by scopes and pressure, we're also able to provide, to map the origin of the biodiversity impact to specific regions and countries of the globe. So here for this case study, we can see that the activities generating the most impact are located in China, India, Brazil, and the United States. Sorry for that. Charles? That's okay. So now that we have seen like a few breakdowns, let's dig a little bit deeper and talk about sectoral allocation, because that's always interesting for asset manager and portfolio manager to understand from which sector the impact is coming from. But to understand that, we first have to look at how the stocks 600 is allocated to several sectors. And that's what is shown on this graph. You can see that the chemical sector is preponderant, so it represents roughly 20% of total investment, with 57 unique entities having this as their main sector. Other really big sectors are the financial intermediation sectors with 12%, and then you also have food processing and manufacturing of machinery and equipment. And having this information in mind, it will allow you to better understand the next slide, which shows impact for each sector. So the bar represents the absolute impact expressed in normalized metric, MSI PPB star. And the black dot is actually the absolute investment in billion euros. And what you can see here is that the chemical sector is responsible for most of the impact. That's roughly 19%. And it's also, no, sorry, 18% of the impact. And it's roughly 20% of the advancement. And this graph allows you to understand a little bit about sector intensity, because, for example, the processing of food products sector, even with a small investment, that's roughly 4% of total investment, it generates 7% of the total impact of the portfolio. And if you compare it to the manufacture of small equipment sector, that's the orange arrow on the graph, you can see that for 7% of the investment in this sector, it only generates 3 or 4% of the total impact. So this really allows you to compare sectors between one another and to understand which sector are really impactful compared to others.
And so now if you want to have the approach and understand not the sectors, but which entities are the most emissive, we've provided also the top 15 most impactful entities. So here we can see that Nestlé is the most impactful entity. Why is that so? Because we just saw on the previous slide that the food sector is a really intensive sector, and as Nestlé represents more than 95% of the investments in the food industry, this explains this really strong impact. What's really interesting to notice here is the diversity of impacts depending on the sector at which belongs the company. So if we look at the food industry company, so if we keep looking at Nestlé, we see that the land use impacts are really predominant compared to other impacts. But on the other side, if we look at HSBC, for instance, that is a financial company, we see that climate change is predominant this time. This is due to carbon for finance methodology, which attributes the emissions of the financial institutions to the activity they finance, including scope 3 emissions. Lastly, if we look here, we see that we have a lot of chemical companies, which with a medium impact, but the fact that there are lots of them explains why chemical sector is the first sector on the slide. And now we come to the slide that might interest you the most, because the last analysis we provide is the measure of the contribution of each entity to your portfolio. So how to read this slide? Basically, if you take Nestlé once again, it means that if you take out Nestlé of your portfolio, your global intensity will be 4 points lower. We can have exactly the same logic for best performers of the portfolio, which are represented here with blue bubbles. So you need to bear in mind that here we're talking about best performers in the current portfolio, but it doesn't mean they're best performers in absolute. And so what are the insights that you can take out of this? It's easy to think that you can just take out the most emissive companies to get a more efficient portfolio. But we strongly believe that it's really important to have a sectorial approach in order to identify best-in-class actors per sector. Because indeed, if you take out the most emissive companies, you will for sure get a less intensive portfolio, but you will not contribute to the transition. It's really crucial that the actors that are in the sector, the most emissive sectors, find ways to finance their transition. So this is it for our analysis. And now that you really understood it well, we're going to show you a glimpse of our platform, of our upcoming platform. Of course, we've not decided to make a live demo because we know this never works. And we're going to pray for it to work this time. Yes. So as you can see, you can log in and explore different portfolios. You can log in and explore different portfolios. So let's stick with the stock 600 here. As you can see, you will find all the different metrics we've seen just now, the MSA PPB star absolute, and also the possibility to compare to a benchmark in a very visual way. You will find the different compartments and also bubbles to help you understand the metrics and navigate through them, because we understand it's not easy to use them at first. So you can also find the different pressures we've talked about, and also the predominance of the scope 3 we were talking about previously. Today you will be able to import your portfolio, and very soon you'll be able also to export them with raw data, but also with visualized PDF that will help you in your reportings to complete your reportings. We just saw that Nestlé was the most intensive company, so maybe you want to deep dive into the corporate company data to understand a bit more deeply its impact, and this is something you can do on the platform, as there are lots of corporate pages. So this was a really quick look at the platform, but you will be able to deep dive much more in details very soon. And now I will leave the floor to our clients to explain the impacts of biodiversity and how they use our data.
Well, first, thank you for all the team work. Like we worked a lot with Antoine Vallier from CDC Biodiversité to develop this analysis, and all the team for all the hard work, because it's been a great challenge, huge challenge to develop this database in such a short time. So thank you all, and I'm very proud of my team. And now welcome Laurent on the board from CDC Group Caisse des Dépôts Asset Management Division, and Léo Garnier from Rift, the CEO of Rift FinTech. Well, we have been very busy these last few weeks testing the database with various actors like asset owners, asset managers, banks, fintechs. And we are very happy to have Rift and Group Caisse des Dépôts with us today to testimony on the usage of the data. So first, maybe Leo, can you tell us a bit more about Rift?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the invitation. We are very pleased to share a bit of our insight for collaboration with Global Finance, and especially the BIA-GBS database. So RIFT is an initiative that started with the statement that there is more than 60% of retail investors that would like to take into account non-financial characteristics of financial product when it comes to investment decision, but that there is less than 6% of them that have been proposed and responsibly, socially responsible investment by their financial advisor. The two main reasons we identified to this problematic is that first, there is a lack of accessibility and transparency of the financial product. It has not been a habit to share a lot of non-financial data to the retail investors when it comes to investment decision. And second, I think that's why we are here today, is that there is not yet common methodology that have been completely developed and democratized on whole the financial world when it comes to environmental characteristic and the financial product, and even more social or societal characteristic. That's why we built RIFT. It's a mobile app that first allows the retail investor to have access to what is hidden behind his financial product, so what sector he financed, what kind of asset he financed, who is managing its portfolio. And second, to have access on the environmental and the social footprint of its investment, so the carbon footprint, soon the biodiversity impact. This is the first part of the application. The second part is to empower them through a daily pedagogical content to allow them to feel comfortable when it comes to discuss about non-financial characteristics of the financial product. And the last part is an action part where we are helping them and support them to take back the control on their savings to align their financial product with their core value. In a few words, that's what it is. And yeah, maybe just it has been launched earlier this year. We have a bit more than 25,000 people that have downloaded it, and 3,000 people, sorry, that have already taken action, meaning either getting in touch with their financial advisor to discuss about non-financial characteristics, either having already chosen new financial products that are aligned with their value.
Congratulations. Thanks, Rick. And Laurent, maybe?
So Caisse des Dépôts. Caisse des Dépôts is well known as a state-owned French development bank, and it's also the manager of mandate given to Caisse des Dépôts and trusted to Caisse des Dépôts by the state. But Caisse des Dépôts is also a large investment manager, and more precisely an asset owner, managing nearly 200 billion euros in diversity of financial instruments, equity, fixed income, funds, and also real assets like real estate and even forests.
Okay, so now talking about biodiversity, what's the ambition and the challenge for la Caisse des Dépôts to operate and to take into account this new information in your portfolio?
Actually, as investment managers, we consider asset owner, we consider ourselves long-term responsible investors, and we consider that we have a responsibility in the biodiversity footprint of the company we invest in. So we want to take into account this responsibility in our decisions. We want to be able to engage companies about their biodiversity impact, just as we do for, let's say, a climate impact.
Okay, great. And RIFT is a bit different because you don't manage assets directly, but have you seen an interest in your customers today to have information or insight on biodiversity?
I think that most of you have seen that is the next hot topic. I think that it's commonly agreed that climate change needs to be taken into account in investment decision. It's not completely common yet that biodiversity too. So I think it is the next hot topic, and that our user needs to be empowered to be able to challenge their advisor when it comes to impact on biodiversity. And maybe what also I think it's quite important to mention is that all the work that is doing Global Finance, it's mainly directed professional of the sector. I guess that most of the people that are following the webinar are quite familiar with this notion. And even for people that are familiar, it's not that easy to understand what is a MSA PPB star. And so I think that our key role is also, as we have done together when it comes to carbon footprint, to be able to explain it in few words and to make it accessible for anyone, even somebody that is not familiar with biodiversity and impact on biodiversity.
So Laurent, the next big question, especially for us, is the usage of the data, because you're a very large asset owner, you have a global coverage and you cover many types of assets. What do you think, what are your needs in terms of data, and what do you think Carbon for Finance and CDC Biodiversité can help you with this challenge?
Actually, our preferred way of managing portfolios is by having specialized portfolio managers who are also financial analysts looking thoroughly into the economics, financial and industrial aspects of the company we invest in, but there are no specialists of biodiversity. So it appears that it's quite, especially as we invest frequently in large companies. For myself, I'm responsible of selection of funds and of equity portfolio management. In equity, for instance, we mainly invest in large internationally diversified companies. So it's pretty difficult to evaluate the biodiversity impact of one company. So obviously, we are very interested in any data that may help us do so. So we were interested in the CDC Biodiversity work, I would say, from the start. Last year, we conducted the first experiment on the stocks 200 in order to evaluate the coverage and the ease of use of the data. It appeared that the data were extremely interesting, but it was quite at the time difficult to manipulate. So we were very happy to learn that they have entered into an arrangement with a data provider who would let this data be available much more easily for investment portfolio managers and for ourselves. And indeed, the test we conducted with next test we conducted with CDC Biodiversity just this year shows that indeed the coverage is very large and nearly total on our investment universe in Europe, at least. And the data was quite easy to use and to apply, and it has been quite easy to measure in this test the portfolio footprint on the test portfolios. So yes, we are very interested in the product, and
thank you for your feedback.
Okay.
So I think for us it's quite clear that there's a strong link between climate and biodiversity, and especially as it was already mentioned earlier, that the importance of a scope 3. There's a parallel between the biodiversity footprint and carbon footprint, and the importance of having this full value chain assessment. Last time you conducted the test, it was only with scope 1 and 2 GHG emissions, and I remember your feedback. It was difficult to interpret the results because there was some lack of data. So what's your next feedback now? You have a complete set of data, and it's easier to find some message to say?
Yes, indeed. Actually, what we want to look at is, I would say that we want to look at 3 levels on the portfolio level in order to know where we are compared to, for instance, the average of the universe. And it will help us to set to ourselves goals in order to decrease the biodiversity impact. We want to look at also on sector level, since, as was explained, it's certainly maybe something to take into account while deciding for strategies on the long term. And we want to look at it on a company by company level within the sector, since as a preferred way of acting on biodiversity, for instance, but it's also the same for climate, let's say, is to engage companies and express to those companies the importance of the topic for us. So we have for this, we need for this company data on the company basis, and we want to be able to compare it within one sector. So at this time, the product is quite satisfying, but I would say that the direction in which it should be improved would be to have data on a company basis that would be based on the real impact of the company rather than an estimate on the sector. But that's a direction.
That's the roadmap for 2023 indeed. So Leo, do you want to say a last word?
Yeah, maybe I think what I'm proud of when it comes to collaboration is carbon fund finance. I could on the CIA database, but I'm sure we'll succeed to it on the BIA-GBS database. That first we have succeeded to have a global notation on all kind of financial product, so funds, but also Eurofund for insurance company, bank saving, etc. And I think that's very powerful, and it's important that all kind of retail financial product can be assessed, and not only the fund, which is a small part of the market. And I think a second part that is really in our core DNA and that we share with you is the transparency when it comes to the stage of development of the methodology. And I think it's very important that we can explain to the retail investor, and I guess the same for the professional of the sector, what are the limits of the methodology, how it will be improved, and how to read numbers not completely blindly, but to find really actions to take. Sure.
Okay, thank you for your participation and your feedback. Very appreciated. Saying that where we have already performed some official reporting for some clients, for example, for a French asset owner, La Maïf, you can see that in their extra financial report of this year, there's a full analysis of their portfolio compared with dedicated benchmark on equities and fixed income on climate risk and biodiversity impact. And for La Financière de l'Échiquier, asset manager, their extra financial report as of end of June has been released as well with a biodiversity analysis. So we can say that the global coverage is okay now. So you can assess your portfolio with a benchmark because it's new indicators. So it's very important to have this referential in mind to compare your portfolio with a benchmark, to compare a company with its sector, so that you try to understand what's my impact and where does it come from. We'll try, I don't know, I'm not sure, we'll try to the video.
Biodiversity loss is the crucial issue for our planet and our society. The disruption of ecosystem can result in major environmental disturbances which may not only affect population around the world, but also lead to significant losses in capital. Indeed, many industries depend on biodiversity and ecosystem services such as agriculture and construction. We strongly believe that the financial sector has a key role to play. Therefore, La Financière de l'Échiquier has committed to address biodiversity loss and join the Finance for Biodiversity pledge. We will consequently measure the impacts of our portfolio on biodiversity, set targets, engage with companies in order to improve business practices on biodiversity protection, and reports on its assessments to our investors and stakeholders. The first step is to measure the biodiversity footprint of our portfolio, and we have selected Carbon for Finance and the CDC Biodiversity methodology to help us on this journey. Assessing the impacts of company on biodiversity is complex for several reasons. We must understand the complexity of ecosystem and identify the key driver of biodiversity loss. As the impact first occurs on a local scale, it requires to geolocalize the company's assets and activity. And finally, we have to deal with the lack of uniform data and disclosure from companies. Carbon for Finance and the CDC Biodiversity will help us tackle this challenge. The Biodiversity Impact Analytics database provides us with meaningful quantitative information on portfolio impact that is complementary with our internal qualitative analysis. Their global approach on climate and biodiversity data, the self-care platform, and aggregated indicators give our portfolio manager and analyst the necessary tools to manage our biodiversity impact and environmental impact of our portfolio. They also provide us with meaningful information to engage with company, another crucial aspect in order to improve business practices. This is just the beginning. There is a lot to be done in order to achieve our ambitious goal. Therefore, we are excited to work alongside Carbon for Finance, CDC Biodiversity, and the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation to help financial institutions improve their practices and how they assess companies' impact, and finally, reverse biodiversity loss.
Is there any question here on site? Or do you have any question here? Or we take the question online?
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm from Tanvea. My question is about the methodology, and it was the first time I asked it, so maybe I've never seen it. Biodiversity is a topic that is very local, and especially when you look at aquatic impact, for example, it's at the water basin, and when you look at the impact on the ecosystem, obviously, I'm breathing properly. When you look at the impact on an ecosystem, it depends on the ecosystem, it depends on the biomass, the soil, everything. So I'm a little bit curious to see the results because it seems at the moment it's really based on a combination of sector level and country level analysis, which which for biodiversity for me seems a little bit too high level at the moment to have a proper understanding of the impact of each company. So I understand that you map probably very well all the sector impacts, but I'm very curious to see, for example, if you take Nestlé and Danone, okay, it's the same sector, but they have very different portfolio of products and activities. So what would be the impact of their portfolio of products and activities? And if you're a mining company in Chile and you're in the desert of Atacama, or if you're on the coast, or if you're in the mountains, obviously it's not at all the same ecosystem, and it's not at all the same impact. So again, I've not seen the result, but I'm a little bit curious to understand how this very high level analysis can be applied to a company specific.
It's right, but taking back I think for the ones who, because there's a micro, for the one who couldn't hear the question is about biodiversity is more like a very localized impact. So if we don't have information on asset-based or site-level information, how can we assess the impact on biodiversity of these companies? I think for Nestlé and Danone, for example, it's very integrated groups. So we don't just limit at what's the main sector or the main country. We looked at a lot of information, so the very granular breakdown of their activities and where they operate these activities. And you're right, it's at country level, but the business model of Nestlé and Danone is already very different between all the subsectors of activity they are performing and where they are performing these activities. In the physical risk database that we've got, we have already analysis of these companies where to have more detailed information and where exactly they operate this type of activities, but it's still at country level. So the roadmap for 2022 is to acquire some site level information and to zoom in. You can't have this information on all sectors. I think the objective of this first version of the database is to cover all sectors, to start telling a story about biodiversity, because site level information are mostly available for capex or industrial sectors, or even for agriculture. There is very few information, agriculture information. It's mostly on factories or so. I think there's still an issue at gathering this information to have precise information. So the first step is try to understand your portfolio. And then you're right, we will collect more information at the company level and site level to have a more greater understanding.
Just to answer to your question, you can find on our website, of some companies. You have an example in mind. That's what we have done with Schneider Electric. That's only 9% of Schneider Electric incomes are in France. And we have been able, working with them, to score the whole activities of Schneider Electric all around the world. So it is possible. You can find. It's a long job. it was experimental. They put many people on that, but it is possible to do that, what you asked for.
General Electric is a great example because it was the first company, like a large company, to have done this biodiversity footprint, and 70% of their biodiversity impact comes from climate change. So as we already collect a lot of information on climate, and we've got this bottom-up analysis to replace and to refine this information in the Global Bio model, that's help us to, even if we've got this sectoral, country-level information, plus the very granular information on GHG emissions, that will help us to have more precise information on companies. Like the company in the agro sector won't have the same biodiversity impact because there's much more information on them. They have different business model, they operate in different countries, and they don't have the same GHG emissions. Antoine?
Yes, but to complement maybe more on the methodological side and the way it works, when you always have to keep in mind the perimeter on which you're doing this analysis and the type of use that you will do as well. That's true that the GBS is not done to pilot biodiversity at the local level, and is not designed to capture the specificity of biodiversity between different sites. The idea is really to get a picture of the full value chain of a company, of an investment. But we keep the traceability in terms of country, in terms of raw materials. So afterwards, when we'll get more data, when we'll get more transparency as well within the supply chain, we will probably be able to go more at the local level and then plug complementary tools that would be more designed to really, after that, go for a specific site. If I get back to the example of Nestlé that you were mentioning, if we do an assessment with Nestlé, for instance, we might find out that most of their, a large part of their impact come from the feed of the cattle that they need to produce the dairy products, for instance. At this stage, it's very difficult to know exactly where this feed come from. Exactly the fact that we have the industry and the region would give us an idea of the average supply chain for that type of industry and region, but we don't know specifically for Nestlé. So then we will either work directly with them, or on for BIA-GBS, we will hope that they will start reporting on where this feed come from, and then we would be able to maybe say that this feed comes especially from Brazil, from this region in Brazil, and at a later stage, maybe there will be a complementary tool to really pinpoint the eco-region which is really at stake for Nestlé, and they would be able to react on this eco-region and the specificity of the biodiversity in this eco-region. But there's quite a long way to be done to reach that level of information and traceability. So the GBS is not designed to go, we hope that we will be able to go that far, but once we reach that level of precision, most probably we would rely on complementary tools to deal with the local biodiversity. Maybe some other questions in the room?
About carbon footprint, there is a high concentration of the most emissive companies on some sectors. Do you observe the same concentration on biodiversity since you are covering the stocks 600, that is all the sectors?
Yes, you have the same, we observe the same phenomenon. So some sectors are way more intensive in terms of biodiversity footprint, just as some sectors are more intensive than others in carbon emissions. So I would say, yes, we definitely observe the same phenomenon.
Est-ce qu'il y a un lien entre, est-ce que c'est les mêmes?
Oh, there is a link since we use carbon emissions as an input to measure the pressure climate change. But it's not a linear link. It's not always a linear link. So you not necessarily see the same sectors which are really intensive in carbon emissions and which are really intensive in biodiversity, because the GBS also takes other inputs and consider other pressures such as the land use pressure, which is not captured by, which is not modeled by the CIA C4F data as an input. So it's a completely different pressure, which can explains the difference in biodiversity intensity among sectors. Let's see.
Vous nous montrer les questions.
Yes, so to complete Theo and Tezo's answer, we have what we observe so far on the listed corporates is that we see the sectors from climate, they appear as intensive on biodiversity because they do participate to the climate change pressure. And you have also all those new sectors which are land intensive, so food industry and all the materials intensive sectors, manufacture, mining, etc.
Maybe Charlie, if you can read the questions, if there are some questions.
So I picked a few questions.
You already?
Yes.
Okay.
There was one about the intensity in BIA-GBS, whereas it was intensity in terms of turnover or investment.
We provide both, but in the slide for it's for the intensity which showed in the slide, it was expressed as per billion invested and not per billion turnover. But we can provide both metrics.
Yes, and it depends how you want to use it. If you want to optimize your portfolio in terms of performance regarding picking the right companies, it's probably more coherent to look at the intensity in terms of euro of turnover of your underlying corporate. Whereas if you're more on the reporting framework where you want to see what is your portfolio participation, the intensity in terms of euro invested would be more appropriate. There was another question that I will take quickly about the fact that do we consider scope 3? So I was quick on the key concepts. So I want to highlight the fact that yes, the GBS and BIA-GBS do integrate scope 3 upstream systematically. And the future development for BIA-GBS would be to also take into account scope 3 downstream for high-tech sector where the downstream is will be very important. For instance, pesticide production or recycling industries, etc. Maybe one for you, Marianne, about the data updates for BIA-GBS.
So we've got annual updates of each issuer. So that's how we do for climate. So there will be an annual review of all the impacts. And as of 2022, we will start adding some biodiversity data collection and assessment in our usual production plan that we do for climate data, so that we'll participate to have to develop some modules and specific information that will be collected for high-tech sectors. And we'll start with the food industry, of course, biodiversity.
There was another one about the dependency. As I went a bit fast on that part, it's a new feature that we're developing, and I didn't explain how it was produced. We basically use Anchor database. It's a database which is produced by UNEP WCMC, and that basically lists for a bit more than 150 industries and 21 ecosystem services the level of dependencies, the level of dependency of those industries regarding those ecosystem services. And what we do is that we plug that information to the Exio-based industry framework. So in that way, we are able to produce a biodiversity score for each Exio-based sector for scope 1 and scope 3, taking into account the structure of the supply chain. And then for BIA-GBS, we use the split of activities in terms of sector and region for each corporate to have a dependency score for scope 1 and scope 3 at the corporate level. So at this stage in the platform, it will be a single score, but we do intend to develop that feature because it will be more and more needed, especially considering the regulatory framework, which is evolving and which highlights the fact that it's also important to identify the dependencies for the investments. One more question. Don't hesitate in the room if there are questions coming. Very welcome. There was one about the validation on field for the biodiversity data. So I think it's more about the GBS itself and actually more about Global itself. The way Global works is that they basically use a meta-analysis of scientific articles that for each pressure in each type of ecosystem capture or give some information on the impact pressure relationship, and that's how they build those local regression to actually have this impact pressure relationship for each of the pressure and the different ecosystems. It's not something that is, so it's at the beginning it's calibrated on observed impacts, but then there's no calibration to go on field and to see if the MSA level is actually what they modelize. But we do work on this. It's a future development that will be very important for the GBS is how to anchor this MSA to what we observe on field. That's one of the reasons we actually chose to work with the MSA, because it's linkable to an observed level of biodiversity on field. We are launching a thesis on that to design protocols to how to measure the MSA on field, and also to how to measure gains and losses based on on ecological surveys.
There was another methodological question about double counting. Where we treat double counting for climate data and carbon emissions, but how do we do that for biodiversity?
For biodiversity, it's we do for the first version of BIA, we don't treat the double accounting at a portfolio level. We don't count it for the climate change, so it means that we don't retreat the GHG emissions, and we do the same for the other pressures to be coherent between the different pressures.
If there's no other question, maybe Antoine, do you want to say final words before we close the session and the webinar? And there will be a replay. We will send the slides as well and the video that couldn't be shared with you today. And thanks for your participation.
Thank you very much, Ariane. Thank you for all the people who talked this afternoon. Just a few words to end this session. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our partner, Carbon for Finance and GBS team for that strong mobilization in the last recent months to achieve this launch. It was a very good job. We are very proud of that. We will send you every video, slide, and so we'll keep all this information with you, and our team are available to ask you your question in the next several weeks and months. I would also like to thank our shareholder, la Caisse des dépôts et consignations, for this continuous support, and of course our clients for who place their trust in us, and in particular, RIST and Caisse des Dépôts Asset Management, who gave us the pleasure to participating today. As Marc reminded us, we firmly believe that finance is has a major role to play in the transition towards a sustainable world. And for us, the launch of BIA-GBS is one important step. This partnership is for long term, and we will be there to improve the methodology and the data. Largely, the global ecosystem is very supportive, with many international meetings this year, next year, growing interest from companies and ambitious changes in the regulation and the convergence for environmental issues, in particular climate and biodiversity. So we have the right cards in hands. Nature is resilient. It's not too late to act, but it must be done quickly and hard. Thank you for your attention, and hope to see you soon.